This is a story about how I, my friends, my heroes, and everyone else was completely, embarrassingly wrong about one very important thing about why microphone preamps sound like they do, because nobody would do these tests. My name is Jim. I'm this guy. You might know me as this guy. And look at these huge consoles! They're so cool and rare, and they were used to make my favorite music. My favorite engineers have told me how the preamps and Neve consoles are warm and fat, and the preamps and API consoles are fast and snappy, and the preamps and SSL consoles are tight and clear. And it always feels like an honor to be in the room with one of these. Preamps are something I didn't know anything about when I moved to Nashville out of high school. They were just kind of there, and they all seem the same. You plug a mic in, turn it up, and whatever, it does its job. So I just used whatever was built into the cheap interface I had. But the more I got into recording, the more I was taught about their differences. And I started to realize that if there are all of these tonal differences, then my preamps that were just built in with my interface would be holding me back. I wouldn't have that sound. So to get those sounds, all I had to do was buy a few of each type and, oh my God. Wait, really? 4,000? That's not even vintage. Okay, plan B. My favorite album was tracked through the Neve console at Oceanway, and I cared so much about understanding that sound. I did my research, and I learned that the console at Oceanway is a Neve 8078 from the 1970s, and I learned that Neve 8078 consoles have Neve 31105 preamp and EQ modules, and that's where the tone I wanted would be coming from. And as fate would have it, one day I saw a racked Neve 31105 preamp and EQ module from a 1970s Neve 8078 console come up for sale, ready to plug in and play. And I made the most expensive purchase of my life so far, trading 6 months worth of rent for this preamp because I needed to know what this tone was. And I loved it. It was fat, it was warm, it was vintage, it was oozing with vibe and cool factor, and I was really happy. Then after a few months, I got into a kick where I'd test things, and I thought, hey, why not test the Neve versus something silly, like the built-in preamps on that cheap interface I used to use. And they sounded the same. So I tried playing into every preamp I had. This video will be very different. With guitars and amps and microphones, I knew they sounded different and I wanted to find out why. With preamps, it kind of seems like they all sound the same, and it is extremely important to me that I find out when they don't, because 6 months of rent hangs in the balance. This is the quest for the missing preamp tone. Okay, one reason the internet says I might not have heard the difference between real deal vintage Neve and garbage is because electric guitars have limited bandwidth. They do not cover the full frequency spectrum that humans can hear. That's true. I do have a drum kit. The kick drum is the lowest thing I worry about, and the cymbals are the highest things I worry about. What if I mic those and split it out to each preamp and flip back and forth between them? What does that sound like? Okay, that's not it. So the internet says it might be hard for me to hear the difference on an individual track, but it's easy to hear the difference in preamps when every track is recorded through either something great or something crappy, because the character of the preamp builds up across the mix. That sounds like it might be right. It's just that nobody with the time to do that has ever had the ability to do it well, and nobody with the ability has ever had the time. Until now, I'll take the bullet and be that guy. I recorded an entire mix, one mic at a time, with that mic split out to both the Neve and the garbage.
I just need you and a car to ride. I just need you and a car to ride. You and a car to, you and a car to. I just need you and a car to ride.
Huh. Well, I didn't hear any built-up preamp character, but the internet says, oh, no, this mix is too busy and commercial. The preamp's character shines through on more delicate music. Okay, I can give that a shot.
I just need you and a car to ride. I just need you and a car to ride. You and a car to, you and a car to. I just need you and a car to ride.
No, you hear the preamp character better when you push the preamps with heavy music. But I don't even listen to that kind of music. I'm still not finding the missing preamp sound. So the internet says maybe my examples just aren't the right examples and I need to be more scientific. Okay, I can do that. I can use Room EQ Wizard to send a sweep of every frequency humans can hear through each preamp and then show on the graph exactly how different they are. For context, everyone I know says Neves are warm. They also say ribbon mics are warm. So let's look at a graph of a Royer 121 ribbon mic, which is warm, compared to a Shure SM57, which is not warm. Okay, cool. The Royer has about 9 dB less energy up here and 9 dB more energy down here. So maybe the warm Neve has something that looks kind of like this when compared to the garbage preamp. And they're the same. They're within 1/4 of a dB from 20 Hz to 20 kHz. But hey, maybe a dB is a lot, and that might mean half a dB is something. And 1/4 of a dB is almost more than half a dB. So what if that is making a difference? So I dialed in an EQ to make 1/4 of a dB dip here and here, and then flipped it on and off and listened to it.
I just need you and a car to ride. I just need you and a car to ride. You and a car to, you and a car to. I just need you and a car to ride.
And I couldn't hear a difference. But maybe I'm biased. Maybe I subconsciously don't want there to be a difference, even though I'm one of the few people who actually did get my hands on the real thing. So I took my subconscious out of the equation and did a blind ABX listening test for, what's a good number, 100 rounds. I'm gonna hit show results now. And according to math, I would have been better off flipping a coin. But that's just my ears, and I'm just a performer. The internet still says that Neves are not only warm, but they are punchy. What does punchy mean? It means the preamps respond to the input and have subtle compression. Subtle compression? Geez, maybe I'm just not as talented or accomplished a listener and I simply can't hear the compression that Neve preamps have that garbage preamps don't. And luckily, compression is something I don't have to listen for to see if it's there. Check this out. This is a step test. It puts out higher and higher levels into a piece of gear and plots what it gets back. This perfectly diagonal line is when nothing is in the path, and it gets back exactly what it sent out. This hard horizontal line is distortion, where the piece of gear hits a ceiling and can't put out any higher level, no matter the input. And this slightly more diagonal line is compression. The higher the ratio, the more horizontal it is. A subtle compression might be a 2-to-1 ratio, like this. So let's see how the Neve responds to a step test. Oh. It's perfectly 1-to-1 linear until it hits a ceiling and wigs out, which would be distortion. So in other words, dynamically, it faithfully reproduces any signal with 0 compression unless the signal is big enough to cause hard distortion. So there's no compression, not even subtle compression, just pristine signal reproduction until the signal is louder than it can handle, and then it distorts. But now the internet says, see, distortion, Neves distort. The warmth and punchiness comes from the distortion, the vintage British discrete analog distortion. Maybe it does. Preamps can distort, Anything can distort, like here's a delay pedal in bypass. Its job isn't to distort, and nobody ever hears it distort because nobody ever puts it in a situation where it would distort. But if you're insane and you run a power amp into it, so really, when we hear distortion, it could be the Neve, or it could be the mic going into the Neve, or it could be the next piece of gear the Neve goes into. And I want to figure that out. Let's start with the mic. There are a lot of microphones out there, and I did a big 30-minute long video all about them that's a lot like this video, and you should go watch it if you want to know why. But because of all the work I did there, I'm not worried about the mic itself distorting. But if I'm thinking about preamps, it would be good to know the biggest signals mics are actually giving to the preamp when they're recording music, which would mean putting a mic in front of a kick drum, a snare drum, a rack tom, a floor tom, a hi-hat, overheads, an acoustic guitar, an electric guitar amp and cab, and a vocal. So I did all of that. And this is my spreadsheet. So when I'm reaming on all these instruments, the highest thing that's going to hit the preamp from any of them is 0.97 volts peak. Let's remember that for later. Now let's think about what the Neve goes into. The Neve is never the last thing in the chain. It has to go into something that records the audio. I'm just a performer, I don't know anything about history, but originally Neves were designed to send audio to a tape machine, and tape machines had to be set up so 0 on their meters all meant the same thing, and the better the tape machine, the more headroom it had above that without distorting. So a good tape machine might have had 14 dB of headroom. When digital recorders came around, they were replacing tape machines, and their specs had to be at least as good as tape machines. So they were set up at the factory so their maximum level before distorting was plus 4 dBu with 18 dB of headroom. And if you do the math, that means about 13 volts peak. So the biggest thing that can come out of the preamp and hit the converters without the converters distorting is 13 volts peak. Cool, so in order for us to hear the Neve distorting, this much coming in from the mic has to be enough, but also the Neve has to be sending less than this out. Let's figure out if that's what's happening. I'm just a performer. I don't have a signal generator and an oscilloscope, so I borrowed them. This thing generates a signal, and this thing shows that signal. So if I make the signal go all the way through the Neve, then I can show it comes out of the Neve, like this. The Neve on its lowest gain setting will distort when it's receiving 4.75 volts from a microphone. And when the Neve finally reaches distortion, it's putting out 25.82 volts peak. Let's take a minute and appreciate how mind-blowing this is. First, none of the mics are ever putting out a signal big enough to make the Neve distort, not even close. You'd have to crank the gain knob up to get it there. But even if you did, then the output level of the Neve would be smashing the converters. And long before you got any of the vintage, British, warm, discrete, warm Neve distortion, you'd already be getting tons of cold, cacophonous, bees in a tinfoil box digital distortion. And yes, I double and triple checked this using multiple methods, including making 80 different audio files to run through the Neve and manually recording voltages for each of them. In order to hear Neve distortion, you'd have to crank the input gain past normal and then turn down the fader on the console to at least negative 5.3 dB, which isn't what happens. Every engineer I know tracks with the faders at unity or 0, and they set the preamp gain so the converters don't clip. And mathematically, objectively, every single time in the past, present, or future that an engineer has ever tracked through a Neve with no converters clipping and faders at unity, it is not possible for there to ever be or have ever been Neve distortion. That means distortion cannot be an ingredient of the Neve sound. Oh, okay, so I have to crank the gain and turn down the output so I can get the Neve sound. What? No, how is it possible that you got that from what I was saying? Because that's how you get the Neve distortion. I want the special distortion. So I just found out that in all normal cases, Neve distortion isn't actually happening. But while I've been working on the video, whenever I've talked with friends about the idea that Neve distortion can't happen unless you crank the gain and lower the fader, the person I'm talking to, every time, has said, "Oh, so I need to crank the gain and lower the fader." This is extremely frustrating because no, in the entire history of recorded music, this behavior is an anomaly that amounts to functionally 0% of cases. And by saying, Oh, so I need to crank the gain and lower the fader. You're prioritizing the special distortion of a piece of gear over the reality that you've likely never heard the special distortion of that piece of gear in any music you've ever enjoyed. You have been freed from needing that special distortion as an ingredient in making good music. Why do people still think they want that special distortion when they don't even know what it sounds like? Wait, what does that special distortion actually sound like? This video isn't called Where Does the Tone Come From in Distortion, but now it is. This is Where Does the Tone Come From in Distortion. I'm planning a dedicated video all about distortion, but for now, I'm only worried about answering 2 questions. 1, what does the special vintage analog Neve distortion actually sound like? And 2, is it actually special? Distortion happens when the music is too loud for the gear to handle, or put a little more accurately, when the amount of voltage is higher than the gear can handle. Nobody uses the phrase distortion ceiling, but in the test I've done, that seems to be what's happening. Each piece of gear has a ceiling, where it can't put out any more voltage and the wave gets clipped. The presumption is that each different type of distortion behaves differently around and above this ceiling, and that's what makes them special. And maybe they do. But I don't think I've ever heard a test where anybody has tried to match the frequency response so that isn't causing the difference, and match the amount of distortion so that isn't causing the difference, and then just compare 2 different methods of achieving distortion and listen to how big that difference is. Well, actually, now that I think about it, I do remember one time that happened. But anyway, if we take the Neve and feed it signals like drums and vocals and guitars, but keep track of how far above the distortion ceiling we're going, what does that sound like?
I just need you and a car that runs. I just need you and a car that runs. I just need you and a car that runs. I just need you and a car that runs. I just need you and a car that runs.
Okay, that's real. That's vintage analog British discrete Neve distortion. If you purposefully or negligently set up your gear so that this happens, that's what it sounds like. But is it special? I could rent some preamps and do a big shootout, but that wouldn't actually answer my question. I want to test the absolute limits, and I'm just a performer. I have no way of knowing if these circuits or these plugins do something special that might secretly make them kind of like the Neve. I want something that is unquestionably dumb and not special. So I wrote the distortion plugin. I wasn't exaggerating, I don't know how to code, but I know the crudest version of distortion would be, hey, if it gets louder than this, don't let it get any louder, otherwise don't touch it. This would be hard distortion, the hardest of distortion, or digital clipping, and it's exactly what converters do when they clip, which, remember, is universally regarded as very bad distortion. But if I send the same audio through it and match how far over the distortion ceiling they are, what does that actually sound like?
I just need you and a car that runs. I just need you and a car that runs. I just need you and a car that runs. I just need you and a car that runs.
To recap this whole distortion section of the video, typical mic choices for different instruments don't produce enough voltage to distort the Neve when recording music. And if they did, the output voltage of the Neve would be so high it would clip the converters first. So, Neve distortion has never been an ingredient in professional music, and you don't need to worry about it. Unless you turn down the output fader so you could get Neve distortion without converter distortion. And even if you did, it wouldn't sound any different from the converter distortion you could have gotten for free but purposefully avoided. But Jim, says the internet, analog gear is always distorting. Okay, why do you think that? Look at the total harmonic distortion percentage in the manual. Okay, so total harmonic distortion, or THD percent, is a real thing. It's a measure of distortion, and some gear might be different. Some might have 0.1%, some might have 1%, but I don't know what that means. It'd be good to have context for what that actually sounds like. So I looked at the distortion page of my Neve sweep tests. Since it sent out a perfect sine wave, anything it gets back that deviates at all from a perfect sine wave is distortion, specifically when it's harmonics, or multiples of the frequency being sent at any given moment. And I'm gonna be super generous here. As the gain knob is turned up, the signal-to-noise ratio gets a little worse and the distortion rises, and it looks like it's highest here. So just to pick out a spot, with the gain knob at plus 40, the highest the distortion gets is negative 60.5 dB, when the clean signal is at negative 15.4 dB. That means the distortion is 45 dB quieter. So, in normal use, the ambient distortion level is at least 45 dB quieter than the undistorted signal. Can I hear that? Can you hear that? Can anyone hear that? I tried a few different ways of figuring this out, and my favorite, easiest, fastest, and most unbiased way is to take the Klippel listening test. It's a website, and it gives you the chance to listen to either a song or a couple of sine waves clean and then with distortion. After that, you have to choose whether you think you're hearing the original undistorted version or the version with some amount of distortion. It starts very easy, and then as the test goes on and you get some answers right, the amount of distortion gets less and less, until eventually you're just guessing, and then it gives you the results. So I did that in my acoustically treated studio with really nice speakers that I tuned specifically for the room, and these are my results.
Wait, Jim, that's not fair. Not everybody has that.
Okay, so I also did the test in my kitchen on my laptop with a pair of cheap earbuds, and these are my results.
Wait, Jim, that's not what I'm doing when I'm commenting on your videos.
Okay, so I also did the test in my bathroom sitting on my toilet and listening through the phone speaker, just like you're probably doing right now. And these are my results. In the studio, my threshold for audibility of distortion on a pair of sine waves is negative 71 dB. That's actually insanely good. It means the speaker system is clear and my ears are capable. The sine wave test is sort of a best case scenario for being able to hear distortion. It makes it as easy as possible to hear a difference. In the kitchen on the earbuds, it was negative 42 dB, and in the bathroom on the phone speaker, it was negative 51 dB. So those situations are less ideal for critical listening, but the real question is, how loud does distortion have to be to hear it in music? And here are my results for that. I'm just a performer. I don't know anything about psychoacoustics, but every musical instrument has some amount of overtones, and harmonic distortion is overtones. So very low levels of distortion are susceptible to not being perceived in music due to auditory masking, which is when low volume sounds at a given frequency don't even make it to the brain because that area of the cochlea is already being vibrated by something else that's louder. That's probably why, when it came to music, in any of the three listening environments, it got really, really hard to hear the difference between the totally clean example and the distorted example when the distortion was about 15 dB lower than the clean signal, and then literally impossible beyond about 21 dB.
Oh no, oh no, oh no!
Oh, that's embarrassing. This is gonna suck. I think that I got way lucky on that.
But Jim, maybe that's just your shitty ears. Not everyone's.
Before I even had a chance to wonder if my ears were bad, when I finished the Klippel test, it showed me where the thousands of previous participants ran out of hearing. And minus a few cheaters over here, it's a pretty normal looking bell curve. So it's unrealistic to think that anyone can hear distortion levels in music that are beyond 30 dB below the fundamental. What were the Neve numbers again? Oh, yeah, negative 45 dB. So, while analog gear, or more likely all gear, has a non-zero amount of distortion happening all the time, it is so small that there is literally zero chance that you or I are ever perceiving it. So it cannot be part of the Neve sound. And if you're still skeptical, then cool, take the test for yourself. It's super easy. You can even do it on the toilet.
But Jim, you're clearly not a real engineer because you haven't mentioned slew rate. Every amplifier has a slew rate.
All right, thanks for letting me know. I'll look that up. Okay, preamps are amplifiers. They amplify everything that goes through them, but they can't do it instantaneously. It takes them some amount of time. That amount of time is called the slew rate, and some preamps have a faster slew rate than others. And the worry would be that the preamp isn't going to be able to catch up to the big sudden sounds that it needs to amplify, and it would cut off or shape the beginning of those big sudden sounds. Or wait, maybe the worry is that the shaping is good, and the slowness of vintage preamps makes them actually better than boring, affordable ones that are built into whatever gear you already have. But while this is the image that flowery internet language conjures in my brain, is that actually what's happening? Slew rate is voltage rise over time. So to know how it affects preamps, it seems like it'd be extremely important to know how many volts are we talking about, and how much time are we talking about? Well, I think I already know the volts part from earlier. Just before hard distorting, Neves can handle 5 volts peak on the input and 25 volts peak on the output. So that means when it comes to signal, 50 volts peak to peak is the biggest swing any part of the preamp will ever have to make. Now, how much time does it need? Well, these fades in Pro Tools that I made as an example of how big loud drum hits might be affected are 20 milliseconds, so that would for sure be something. But the problems could start way before that, because if I zoom in on a wave, it's going from its lowest point to its highest point really, really fast, like 5 milliseconds for 100 hertz. So if the slew rate is getting in the way of that, it's going to be an issue. In fact, as the frequency gets higher and higher, the amount of time between the lowest and highest points of a wave gets shorter and shorter, and the slew rate would have to be faster and faster to accurately reproduce it. So let's shoot for the moon. What's the highest frequency I care about? 20 kilohertz, the highest humans can hear. What amount of time does it take a 20 kilohertz wave to go from its lowest to its highest point? 25 microseconds. Holy crap, that's fast. Okay, cool. So for the slew rate to ever affect what we hear, a preamp would have to have a slew rate of less than 50 volts per 25 microseconds, or 2 volts per microsecond. How does that compare to the actual slew rate of different preamps? Well, maybe it's because search engines suck now, or maybe it's because nobody has actually done this before, but when I searched for slew rates of microphone preamps, about half of it was stuff I wasn't looking for, and half of it was people talking without providing actual numbers or measurements, which also isn't what I was looking for. And buried deep in the results, I found one guy that measured a Neve, an API, and a Millennia preamp. And his results were 8 volts per microsecond for the Neve, 10.2 volts per microsecond for the API, and 24 volts per microsecond for the Millennia. So even the slowest of these was 4 times faster than necessary to reproduce all audible frequencies in all conditions. But maybe that one guy's wrong, so I'll be the guy. I'll do it myself. Hey, remember that signal generator and oscilloscope? Well, those can also show how fast the slew rate is. I'm setting this graph so each box is 2 volts tall and 1 microsecond wide. So if the slew rate of the Neve is less than 2 volts per microsecond, aka slow enough to ever affect the sound of the audio in any situation, then the line would be shallow, below 45 degrees, like this. But if the Neve is capable of reproducing a line that's 45 degrees, or steeper, then the slew rate is faster than 2 volts per microsecond, and therefore not a problem. So what happens when I actually do that? Oh, it's pretty steep. Let's do counting. It goes to the right 1, 2 boxes, and it goes up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 boxes. So the Neve is capable of at least 8 volts per microsecond. And amongst people who talk about this stuff, the Neve is talked about as a slow preamp. If the Neve is slow, and it's 4 times overqualified, then everything else that's fast would also be overqualified. And according to math and anatomy, in these cases, slew rate never is, never would be, and never has been audible. But there's another way to look at it with less math. We can just see if the bad thing we're worried about actually happens. If the slew rate is slow enough to be bad at amplifying high frequencies at high voltages, then I can just send sweeps of different voltages through the Neve and see if the results are ever different. So I did. And there's literally 0 difference in high-end frequency response, even if the Neve is working with the highest frequencies humans can hear at maximum voltage. Okay, turns out the cartoonish idea of the slew rate of a Neve shaping the front end of drum hits like a crossfade would only be possible if the slew rate was literally 10 times, 100 times, 3,000 times slower than it is.
Jim, you're clearly not a real engineer. You haven't mentioned impedance. The preamp uniquely interacts with the mics because of impedance.
Alright, I'll look that up. Okay, impedance is an electrical term. It's like resistance, but for when resistance is different for different frequencies. Mics have an output impedance and preamps have an input impedance. So this could make the same mic sound different if it's going into a different preamp. Okay, does it? I got out my mic testing rig and set up each of my mics, then did a sweep test with them plugged into the Neve and a sweep test with them plugged into the garbage. And these were the results. Okay, cool. This is not nothing. It may even almost be something, but I've got to check how big these differences actually are. And the biggest difference in any of these is negative 0.9 dB at 200 Hertz. So what does that sound like?
I just need you in a car to run. I just need you in a car to run. You in a car to, you in a car to. I just need you in a car to run.
And everything else I got was less different than that. There might be a mic out there with a weird output impedance and a preamp out there with a weird input impedance that makes this a bigger deal, but at least with all of these, impedance isn't an ingredient in the Neve sound.
But Neves have inductors. The sound of the Neve is in its analog inductive EQ. You haven't talked about the EQ.
Whoa, hey, that's moving the goalposts a bit. I thought we were talking about preamps. This video isn't called Where Does the Tone Come From in an EQ, but guess what? Now it is. This is where the tone comes from in an EQ. Okay, so the point of an EQ is to change the sound to make it brighter, darker, fatter, thinner, or some other adjective, and it does this by changing the frequency response of the piece of gear. In other words, if you want something to be brighter, the gear has to do something that makes it better at passing through the treble. If you want something to be darker, the gear has to do something that makes it worse at passing through the treble. I'm just a performer. I don't know anything about circuits, but the inductors in a Neve are part of an inductive circuit that is one way of accomplishing this. And engineers love how musical analog Neve EQs are. And I don't know what that means, but I know that engineers are not so complimentary of the stock Pro Tools EQ plugin, which contains no inductors or any other analog parts. So I did some tests of my own, and the stock Pro Tools EQ makes clean, cold, calculated frequency response curves like this. And the Neve makes warm, creative, musical analog frequency response curves like this. Oh, they're pretty much the same. But that isn't fair of me. I did have to dial the Pro Tools EQ to match what the Neve does, but the fact that I can even do that at all kind of blows up the thing I used to think, which was that digital EQs just can't do what analog EQs do. But what happens if I change the gain? Oh wow. So that's the analog EQ sound. It isn't that the curves are uncopyable, it's just that the bandwidth of the boosts and cuts might be different as the amount of booster cut changes. Like the Neve starts out wide and gets more narrow, whereas the Pro Tools EQ keeps the same width no matter the boost. So maybe that's what engineers are calling musical. Sure, every individual curve is matchable by digital methods, but the analog EQs automatically have this behavior, and digital doesn't. Unless you spend $250 for this plugin, then it matches almost perfectly. Or $100 for this plugin. Or $35 for this plugin. But I'm just a performer, I don't know anything about making EQ plugins. And that brings up a really good point. I'm just a performer. I'm just a guy who plays guitar and owns a camera and spent 6 months of rent on a preamp with the goal of figuring out how much of an effect the legendary Neve console at Ocean Way Nashville Studio A might have had on the sound of my favorite music. Sure, I hunted down the exact vintage module they have, but at the end of the day, no matter how ironclad all my tests and data are, it isn't the same as actually getting to go to Ocean Way and test their board. You know I had to do it, right? This is Ocean Way Nashville Studio A's 1970s Neve 8078 board with 31105 preamp and EQ modules. This is the board that my favorite music was tracked through. And it is one of the most important things in the world to me to find out what the sound of this board is, and if I can somehow have it for myself. So far, from the results of all of my tests, it seems like Neves are not warm. They're flat, from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, just like this. Neves are not punchy. They operate linearly until distortion, just like this. Neves are not reaching distortion under normal use, just like this. Neves, when forced into distortion, don't sound any different from converter distortion, just like this. Neves are not always distorting in a way that anybody can hear in music, just like this. Neve's slew rates are more than 4 times overqualified to perfectly reproduce all frequencies in the human hearing range, just like this. Neve's input impedance is within a normal range, so it doesn't cause major changes in common microphones' frequency responses, just like this. So, theoretically, if I ran the same audio through Ocean Way Nashville Studio A's 1970s Neve 8078 board with 31105 preamp and EQ modules, and also the garbage built-in preamps on my cheap interface, I can't think of any reason they wouldn't sound the same. So I did that. This was a huge moment for me. All of these years I thought that my favorite music sounded the way it does because of the Neve board and its preamps. And so did the people who made that music.
This would be true across the board on all those records. I first of all, I love Neves. I didn't bring any outboard mic pre's. I love the old Neve in Studio A. It's still my favorite one in Nashville.
As it turns out, preamps just make the mic signal louder. There's a bunch of different ways to do that, but if they aren't changing the frequency response, then they're just doing their job. My friends, my teachers, and my heroes have been misattributing the warm, punchy musical sound of the songs they've recorded, giving credit to the preamps that actually should have gone to them and the decisions they made about mic choices, mic placements, drum sizes, tuning, muffling, cymbals, pickups, pickup positions, amp circuit, amp settings, cab geometry, speakers, acoustic guitar body size, string age, pan positions, reverb send levels, volume fader levels. Oh yeah, and I'm just a performer, so I can't leave out all of the actual performances. But I wasn't done. One thing I left off that list that definitely belongs on it is EQ. EQ can absolutely change the sound. If there's one way that a preamp can sound like something, it's because of the specific curves produced by its EQ. So I spent 4 hours in that control room, doing tests of every possible EQ change that can be made on that board. Here are some of the things that the Neve EQ actually does. First, the mid-bells are wide at low gains and get narrower at high gains. We saw that earlier. But the low bell actually moves its center frequency higher with higher gain. So when the low bell knob says 100 Hz, it's only centered on 100 Hz when it's on maximum gain. Otherwise, the center is actually less than what's printed. Maximum gain for all bands is about 18 dB, with the shelves being a little more up around 20 dB, which makes it weird that the Universal Audio plugin emulations I tried only have the shelves go up to 12 dB, and the IK81 and Waves VEQ4 only have the bells go up to 12 dB. And the maximum gain and gain travel for a given knob is about the same for all frequencies in a band, which makes it weird that the Kit Audio Blackbird plugin is all over the place, when it's supposed to be modeling the same type of preamp from the same type of board. All of the frequency knobs snap to specific predetermined frequencies, and they're all pretty close to what's printed on the faceplate, but they aren't always exact. For example, on this channel, 390 is actually 406. Also, there are 10 frequency positions in the midbands, and positions 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 have the same bandwidth, and positions 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 have the same bandwidth, but for some reason, the evens are slightly narrower than the odds. And the real Neve has small opposite resonances that make the curve a little different from a standard digital EQ, even if the bandwidths are matched. And here's what the Neve EQ actually sounds like. I have a hunch that these curves are what matters, and if they are matched, even digitally, then it should sound the same. There's no reason I found that it wouldn't. But while all of the existing plugins I've tried are close, none of them match it exactly. So I wrote the EQ plugin. You know what I am. You know there's nothing special here. There can't be. I don't know how to do that. It's just an EQ. It just matches these curves. But what makes it special is that someone cared enough to put in the hours to measure the real thing and then match the real thing, without any AI at any point in the entire process. AI cannot do this. I am the only one with these data points. By the way, this whole thing is brought to you by my PayPal email address. I made 100% of this video by myself because it needed to exist. And I've been able to do that because when I write my PayPal email address on something I've made to figure out why music actually sounds the way it does, enough people recognize how rare and pure this is, and they chip in to keep the tests going. So, if there's anything else special about the sound of the vintage British discrete analog inductive EQ on the 31105 preamp and EQ module from a channel in the 1970s Neve 8078 board at Ocean Way, Nashville Studio A, then it shouldn't be able to sound the same as a garbage preamp and an EQ plugin written by a guitar player. So what does that actually sound like? Which did you think was which? So usually in other videos, I'll just cut to black and drop the mic and let the truth exist for people to experience. I'm not in the business of telling anyone what they hear, but I'm gonna do a little segment here called Getting Ahead of It. One, is all of this actually real? Yes, 100% of this video and every one of my videos is real. The audio you hear is what I said it was. This is not merely for clicks or entertainment. This is rigorous. Two, are you saying that all preamps sound the same? No, some preamps are broken. And some preamps are made so cheaply or poorly that their frequency response doesn't stay flat from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. I bought a little mixer for $30 on Amazon, and its treble falls off at around 15K. But every musician everywhere can get their hands on something like this, and it'll work great. But Jim, my preamp sounds different. I know it does. Okay, show me. In fact, to help you out, I made a course that shows you exactly how to do a bunch of the stuff I did in this video. Using tools you already have and some free computer programs. I walk you through it, and then you can test not just your preamps, but your pedals and your plugins and other gear to see what it's actually doing. And this has saved me and will save you thousands and thousands of dollars. Then if you do that, you can show me that your preamp sounds different. Or maybe it doesn't. This course is actually a big deal. It's called Find Your Gear's Hidden EQ. It's brand new and it's on jimlilmusic.com. Available instantly to you right now. Like a couple hours from right now, you could know what all your gear actually does. 4, why should I trust you when Big Famous Guy says something different? I've gotten texts from friends that are different versions of this question where they watch an interview or even in the room with a big producer guy and he says, Neves are warm or whatever. So why trust me instead of Big Famous Guy? Because they never did this. Do you know what it takes to make a useful comparison? It has to be identical playing or it's useless. From an identical microphone or it's useless. In the identical spot or it's useless. Split out to the two preamps you want to compare, then the level has to be exactly matched or it's useless. And very short sections of the playing have to be edited back to back with no gap or it's useless. And maybe most importantly, the audio file of the comparison has to exist so that you or anyone else can actually listen to it right now and revisit it later any time to double check it. These are the minimum requirements to begin forming an opinion. If the story was, yeah, on take 3, the guitar was a little bright, so he patched it out of an API and into a Neve. And on take 6, it sounded better. That doesn't do any of that. Big Famous Guys made huge, great, awesome things. And those things were huge, great, and awesome for a lot of reasons. And the Big Famous Guys that I've talked to have never said that during their limited, expensive time in big studios cutting major label music, that the appropriate thing to do was to question whether the giant, awesome console actually sounds different from a Focusrite Scarlett. They're already in the room with the big Neve. They just use the big Neve, and they do whatever it takes to make the richest person in the building invite them back. So nobody knew. And if you wanted to know, you'd have to do everything I did in this video. And nobody ever did that because it takes a long time and it's hard and you risk a piece of your religion and identity being chipped away. And why do that when you have a bunch of other stuff in life demanding your attention? Well, I did it. And turns out when you actually do it, this is what it actually sounds like. Now we know. I gotta say, it's weird finding out that nobody is listening. They're just repeating stuff they've heard. So that inspired a new project I'm doing for anyone that likes this kind of honesty and curiosity and wants to hang out with me without waiting a year between my giant projects. I just started a weekly show where I catch up on important bands and artists that I should really know about by actually listening, and you can do that along with me. Too much stuff out there comes from people who read the Wikipedia page and then repeat it and pretend they're an expert without ever showing you what it actually sounds like. So I'm not doing that. Instead, I'm telling you I might not know anything about this band. Let's forget everything we've been told and just listen to the songs and see what's in there and take home some notes on how to get that vibe in case we're ever asked to. I do that for fun anyway, so why not post it so other people can learn too. The show is called Actually Sounds Like with Jim Lil. If you had to tell someone about it, I'd describe it as listening to music with a professional musician and celebrating the details we notice. The video version will be on the Actually Sounds Like YouTube page and the audio version will be on all the podcast apps. Rapid fire. Jim, are you gonna sell your super awesome, super accurate EQ plugin? Well, I'm glad you asked. No, I'm not. I don't know how to do that. I know that this works 100% perfectly on one computer in this entire universe. I don't know how to make it work on everyone else's computer. And I don't know how to deal with anti-piracy stuff. But are you Waves? Are you Universal Audio? Do you think that people would buy this plugin? Get a hold of me. It's a good sounding EQ. Are you saying that Ocean Way and other expensive studios are worthless? No! Plenty of reasons to like big studios that have nothing to do with their consoles sounding special. Are you saying that expensive preamps are scams? No, they sound great, but inexpensive ones can sound the same. So hopefully people who are paying extra are doing it for the extra features or workflow or because it looks cool and feels cool, and not because they think just passing signal through it gives their music the Neve sound, because as it turns out, that's not really a thing. Are you saying that expensive preamp builders are scammers? No, they don't know. They aren't asking the questions I'm asking, so they haven't found the answers I've found. Specifically the psychoacoustics and blind listening stuff. I watched your video, I hear a difference, and it's subtle, and subtle changes are big difference makers. Check out that psychological trick. The number of times I've seen people attach their identity to a piece of gear, talk about how it's a big difference maker, get shown an actual comparison where it's not a big difference maker, then walk it back by saying it's subtle, and they get away with not admitting they were wrong or changing their minds about anything, while also implying that it's the other person's problem that they don't hear a difference, because it's their inexperience or lack of skill that's keeping them from hearing what the pro hears. Then they build the importance of the gear back up by saying that it's all in the subtleties, or subtle changes make a big difference. Diabolical. Weak. Subtle literally means not big. If anyone says something is subtle, then that means doesn't matter until every single other thing that is not subtle is 100% accounted for. In other words, if you don't have a preference for
mic choices, mic placements, drum sizes, tuning, muffling, cymbals, pickups, pickup positions, amp circuit, amp settings, cab geometry, speakers, acoustic guitar body size, string age, pan positions, reverb send levels, volume fader level,
then you can't have a preference for what preamp you use. All not subtle things are more important than all subtle things. Thank you. What about? I had an engineer once tell me that his boss told him that phase differences in frequencies above 20 kilohertz can combine in ways that affect frequencies under 20 kilohertz, and that's the sound of a console. This is just made up. It's based on literally nothing true. Humans can't hear relative phase changes in different frequency ranges because of the principle of wave superposition. Individual waves combine to form the final wave that hits your eardrum, and they can all ride on top of each other, and while relative phase changes can make the final wave look different under an oscilloscope, it doesn't make it sound different when it reaches our brains. And it would take me time and energy to load up a bunch of signal generators with a bunch of sine waves and bounce multiple copies of them with different flipped phases and do 100 rounds of an ABX test to show that it can't be heard, even if it was in the human hearing range. And this guy was talking about what happens outside of the human hearing range. But I'm not going to do that for every sci-fi fairy tale that gets conjured or repeated by someone who isn't willing to bring any amount of evidence themselves. It takes no effort to make something up. You can use big words and try to say something that feels kind of good, and people who look up to you will just go, huh, and store it away and not question it, and then later repeat it themselves in a social situation for social points. This video could have ended 5 minutes in when I recorded every instrument through the Neve and the Scarlett, and they sounded the same. But I went the extra mile and had enough respect to give a bunch of the other mechanistic theories a chance to show themselves. And in the end, what did you hear?
Some people want money, some people want fame.